Okay, good evening. Buenas noches todos. Thank you for coming tonight. As I look out here, I'm really excited to be able to be a part of this evening and a part of the planning group. And I wanted to, right off the bat, congratulate and thank the core group that actually had this conversation. And it was probably a couple months ago. So to make this happen, there was a lot of planning and patience and getting to know each other rather quickly. So I'd like for Kathy Harris, Paula Triplet, and Linda Hoving just to say hello and wave. I think Paula's going to bring them in here. So when they get in here, I'd just like us to give them a round of applause. This conversation occurred with all of us regarding, I think, some of the reaction or the responses or the outcries to the children being separated from their families. So that's where this conversation stemmed from. And it was just 4 people that represent or are part of other groups coming together, suggesting that we do something to promote Black and Brown Coalition, to promote Black-Brown allies, to come together and actually be strategic about how we work in our community. So I see Paula. Paula, if you want to wave, she's way in the back. Let's give Paula a round of applause for everything she's contributed. Linda Hoving is right up here in the center there. And then I don't see Kathy. Maybe she's chatting back there. But the other person that was brought on board with intention was Becca Velasquez Pulas. Is Becca in the room here? I know she doesn't like to speak. She's in the back too. But please keep these people in mind tonight as you appreciate what we brought to you and thank them for their contributions and their commitment to bringing coalitions together and the importance of that in our community. Thank you. My name is Maggie Rivera, and I'm recently moved to Grand Rapids, but I've worked in Grand Rapids prior and involved in the Latino community groups as well as other groups, but came from the Holland community, was the first elected Latina on the Holland Public School boards there, and appreciated that growth opportunity for me. And as I chose my next community, I was very intentional about Grand Rapids. So I didn't put a bio in here because I think there's a lot more individuals that we want to take time to get to know as well. Like the other co-moderator who doesn't need an introduction, but I wanted to thank Tyrone Bynum for coming tonight. Tyrone, did you have a few words for our group?
Thank you. Well, I didn't come with anything to say, and that's unusual since I'm a talk show host. But anyway, I want to thank each and every one of you so very much for coming out. I want to thank the organizers. A specific thank you, at least from me, to Ms. Kathy Harris and Ms. Triplet. Those are 2 individuals I've worked with for over 20 years, and they keep going at it. They never give up, and that's a powerful statement in itself. Very excited about what we're about to embark upon as far as this journey of knowledge, and I really do appreciate, and I'm very humbled by the invitation to participate, and I'm looking forward to the feedback from not only the information that's given, but the feedback we get from you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tyrone. I wanted to remind everybody if they could please maybe pull out their cell phone if they haven't done so already and go to the Wealthy Theatre and kind of announce that you're here with us and invite friends to come on out. It's not too late to come and join us for the evening, and that would be Facebook at Wealthy Theatre. We're going to go ahead and go right into the next portion of our program, which is the historical perspectives. And, excuse me, we're going to do self-introductions, I'm sorry. So if we could start with Dana on that end, just do a self-introduction.
So again, I echo the sentiments. Thank you for coming out tonight. These are important topics for us to talk about. So my name is Dana Anderson. I'm the Associate Director at Bethany Christian Services. I've been working at Bethany for 15 years, all in refugee and immigrant services. So I started a lot of the unaccompanied children's programs about 12 years ago and have followed the progress of the legislation as it has changed over the years, sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better, in terms of the children crossing our southwest border and seek of safety and protection.
Good evening. My name is Santiago. I'm from Puerto Rico, and I'm visiting faculty at the University of Michigan in Dearborn and in the National University in Senegal, and I'm a researcher at the National Institute of History in Havana, Cuba.
My name is Sergio Cira Reyes. I am a volunteer with Movimiento Cosecha GR. Movimiento Cosecha is a national movement that is seeking dignity, respect, and permanent protection for the 11 million undocumented immigrants living in the United States. We're currently working on 2 initiatives locally. One is we're fighting to end the contract between the Kent County Sheriff and ICE, and the other one is we're doing a pilgrimage to Lansing from October 5th through the 9th to get the licenses back for all the immigrants that are undocumented here in the state of Michigan. I say get them back because 10 years ago we used to have licenses.
My name is Rick Stevenson. I am adjunct professor of African American Studies at Grand Valley State University.
My name is Camila Trefts, and I am the Unaccompanied Children's Program Coordinator at the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center. We are an organization based in Grand Rapids, Kalamazoo, and Ann Arbor, and we provide direct legal services to immigrants across the state.
I'm Michelle LaJoy Young. I'm the undersheriff at the Kent County Sheriff's Office. I've been there for the last 29 years and enjoy my time working in this community.
I wanted to mention briefly, for some individuals here tonight, like this is my first moderating here in Grand Rapids, but for others, this might be their first panel. So we want to give them a round of applause, not only for their experience and knowledge, but for coming up here and being a part of this evening with us. So if we give them a round of applause, thank you. Okay, and now we're going to go right into the historical perspectives. Dr. Stevenson will go ahead and talk about mass incarceration. Whatever you're comfortable with, if you're comfortable there, Judy.
All right, thank you. Let me begin by acknowledging my sincere thanks to Sisters Kathy Harris and Madeline Rivera, also to my colleagues on this board, especially Dr. Santiago Valles, to the A. Philip Randolph Institute and the rest of the team and the committee who invited us to participate in this extremely important discourse. We're talking about injustices that affect primarily black and brown brothers and sisters, and it is probably one of the most important dialogues that we need to be able to engage in. Whether we admit it or not, we are being oppressed by the hands of those who profit from the prison industrial complex, as some of our foreparents did under the same type of system called the convict leasing system during the period of the Reconstruction. The truth of the matter is that the prison industrial complex, mass incarceration, and immigration enforcement mandates are simply another form of slavery. As many of you may know, A. Philip Randolph was a game changer, a civic-minded mover and shaker. He was a social activist and a trailblazer for equal rights in African Americans and the founder of the first president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. We owe great debt to him and people like him, leaders who have gone before us. May we never forget that we stand on the shoulders of those men and women who paved the way and created opportunities that we now experience. Now it becomes our responsibility not only to know the history, but it behooves us to take the baton and run like ... to the finish line. I don't know if it's kids in here or not. My task tonight is to offer some insight into what has been dubbed the modern day slavery for black and brown people. I will approach this topic by analyzing 3 government-led and supported injustices that have continued to cause havoc in the black and brown and now immigrant communities. The first topic is the introduction and the critique of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution as it relates to how government uses a loophole in the second clause of the 13th Amendment to promote the unprecedented incarceration of our people. Secondly, I will offer a cursory discussion on the convict leasing system that started at the end of the Civil War and persisted through the period of Reconstruction and was built on the foundation of the black codes, pig laws, and Jim Crow laws that plagued Southern blacks until the late 60s. The third section would be a synthesis of the 13th Amendment, the convict leasing system, and the present-day prison industrial complex, which I will argue is the government's ways of continuing America's plantation mentality by using inmates to supply free labor for large corporations. I will conclude with recommendations on how we can alert and educate and prevent our sons and daughters from getting caught up in the traps of this insidious government-led funded injustice. The 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment declares, and I quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime, therefore, whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, and any place subject to jurisdiction." This is the way that the 13th Amendment is presented today. However, in the initial composition of Article 1, it reads like this: "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States or in any place subject to their jurisdiction." Notice, in the second reading of the 13th Amendment, it does not make mention of anyone being duly committed. It is this second clause of the amendment that has been used by our judicial system to incarcerate hundreds and thousands of brothers and sisters. Because the 13th Amendment does not clarify what type of conviction precedes a sentence to jail time, that is one of the reasons why mandatory sentencing minimums is so insidious. Think about it. American slavery was technically abolished in 1865. But this loophole in the second clause of the 13th Amendment allows the court to sentence a person to prison and by default sentence them to perform duties to privatize prisons on behalf of large corporations and even government officials. This conviction now serves as an entrance to a privately run government-sanctioned system of slavery. The evidence of prisons in America and American mass incarceration makes it clear that this type of punishment tends to be at a disproportionate rate in the black and brown communities. Our white counterparts do not suffer at the same rate. In the last 150 years, more people of color have been incarcerated in these United States than there were in 1830. These men and women, but mostly men, are essentially performing unpaid labor for large and oftentimes government-sanctioned corporations, which makes the companies rich and keeps the poor poor. The U.S. makes up 5% of the world's population, and at the same time it boasts 25% of the world's prison population, which means that the United States has the largest incarcerated population in the world. No other society in history has imprisoned more of its citizens than these United States. There are 500,000 more prisoners in the United States than in China, which has 5 times the population. The evidence reports that approximately 1 out of 100 adults in America are incarcerated in 2014. Out of the adult population of 245 million in 2014, 2.4 million were in prison. The evidence states that further, the vast majority of these inmates, 86%, have been locked up for non-violent or victimless crimes. Many of them are drug-related. In an article entitled "The Prison Industrial Complex," Earl Smith and Angela Hattery argued, and I quote, "Incarceration has become a multi-billion-dollar industry that relies on incarcerating more than 2 million citizens on a given day in the United States. We are, in fact, addicted to incarceration," end quote. Listen to what I just said. Imprisonment has become an industry. An industry, by definition, is primarily designed to make money. Therefore, what is happening in our criminal justice system is not designed to discipline a person for a crime. It now serves as a merchant for big business to co-opt free labor. There was a time when imprisonment, or when one was in prison, they had the ability to prepare a person to return to society with a better education and a new outlook. And now we know from the research that educating inmates reduces the numbers of recidivism. The United States government commissioned a study in 1965 to determine if education was a deterrent to crime and how better educated persons would live safer in communities. The study proved that the releasing of Pell Grants to incarcerated inmates and allowing them to acquire higher education reduced and lowered the recidivism rate. However, in 1965, the government overturned the higher education rate, stating, and I quote, "No basic grant shall be awarded under this subpart to any individual who is incarcerated in a federal or state penal institution." The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act effectively eliminated the ability of lower-income prison inmates to receive college educations during their term in prison, thus ensuring the educational level of those inmates remained unchanged. Now, the convict leasing system began after the Civil War. The South's economy, the social structure, the infrastructure, and the government structure was damaged, and therefore, in an attempt to rebuild that structure, the Southerners had to figure out how can we make money. The war had destroyed the prisons, the plight of the cities were overwhelming, and blacks and whites were both in significant trouble when it came to the imprisonment. So, the government attempted to solve this problem by leasing larger companies who would house and feed the prisoners. And what they realized was, this is a moneymaker. And so large organizations began having patrols through black communities to arrest people and then sell them or rent them to large companies. For instance, if a young black man was walking down the street and he was stopped by a sheriff and he could not prove he had a job, he would be arrested for vagrancy. If his fine was $10 and he could not pay the fine, a large company would come in, pay the fine, and then lease him to work in that company. And hundreds of thousands of black men were taken off the streets in the South. The same thing is happening with the prison industrial complex. Convicted laborers are oftentimes killed, they lost their lives, they lived miserably, and sometimes their families never knew where they were. Now, when we move forward to the prison industrial complex, we have the exact same thing, where in the 1800s, people were picked up for vagrancy. In the 20,000s, it's called stop and frisk. It's the exact same thing, it's just being refashioned. And so what we have now is in some states or cities, police departments connected to judges who are connected to large corporations who are picking up these men and women off the streets, and now they're ending up in these prisons. Not surprisingly, corporations like Whole Foods, McDonald's, Wendy's, Walmart, Starbucks, Victoria's Secret, Verizon, and Sprint are all lobbying the government for broader and wider crime bills. Why? Because they can use these convicts for free labor. Our sons and daughters and cousins and sisters and brothers are being put in prison not simply because of a crime, but they're being put in prison because they have free labor. Some of the Victoria's Secrets, for instance, their clothing is made in Honduras, but there are female prisoners who are sewing the labels "Made in America" in the clothing. And so some of our people are being taken off the streets because these large corporations are moving in the prison industrial complex the same way they did in the South with the convict leasing system. Now, why is that important? Because companies like Walmart, which is made up of primarily one family, boast this. And I'm almost closing. How much time I got?
You got all the time you need. Keep going.
Okay. Within the Walton family, for instance, you know the Walmarts. They are worth $122 billion. Alice Walton's worth $32.3 billion. Chrissy is worth $5.2 billion. Jim is worth $33 billion. Lucas, $10.4. S. Robin, $31.9. Ann, $4.5. Nancy rounds up the family with $4 billion. In one family, they are worth $122 billion. They own more money than 42% of the bottom half of the American community. One family. And they just got a tax cut from 45. So when Snooki goes to jail on a weed charge, and he can't pay his bail, when he goes to prison because it's his third strike, somewhere in the mix, some of these large corporations will benefit from his imprisonment. And we have to understand that this is not a new deal. It's been going on for the past 155 years. So what is the synthesis? The loophole in the 13th Amendment has become one of the tools used by the racist government to incarcerate black and brown people, and now immigrants. The convict leasing system and its black codes foreshadowed the prison industrial complex. Black codes were restrictive laws designed to limit the freedom of African Americans and now browns and now immigrants. These codes were frivolous, but they were strictly enforced. And I just talked about the vagrancy code. If a person fits the description, he or she can be arrested. And we know what the description is. The term prison industrial complex was first used and coined by Dr. Angela Davis in 1998. She used this term when she was arguing a case for the Soledad brothers. And according to an article composed by Ray Downs, who states this, and I quote, "While being far to the left politically might seem incompatible with investing in prisons, the Democratic Party is totally fine with the incarceration rate as well. Although Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan are largely responsible for the drug war policies that caused the prison population to skyrocket, Bill Clinton was a tough-on-crime president who continued the ideas. And Vice President Joe Biden was the principal player in Clinton's era crime policy. He wrote the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which now has gone defunct. But they added $9.7 billion to it to enforce and to build into the police departments. So that's why I cringe when people say that Bill Clinton was the first black president. Some of his policies are still wreaking havoc in our communities. And I'll close with this section, and then I'll get solutions.
You're fine.
What we fail to realize is this. In states like Louisiana and North Carolina, they passed an act called the Casual Killing Act. It was actually instituted in 1672. The act permitted the killing of a runaway person if he or she resisted, under the assumption that the person who committed the murder was not doing it intentionally, but they feared for their lives, or the person was resisting. Does that sound familiar? Mm-hmm. In Louisiana in 1670 and North Carolina in 1675, they passed laws that stated if you were 16 years old and between 16 and 60 years old, you had to become a slave catcher. The first police departments in this country did not police. They were slave catchers. And that's why when we hear this idea of protect and serve, that wasn't the model. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to protect and serve the corporations, the plantations. And so in our communities, when the police come, most often they're not coming to serve us because they haven't been trained to serve us. So what are the solutions? One, we must get out and vote in November. We must familiarize ourselves with the candidates, their voting records, and their stances on our issues. Everyone in here has a cell phone and a computer. You can go to the government archives and you can find out how these people vote. They ought to be shaking in their boots. Every single politician in this country should be shaking in their boots when they know it's time for us to vote. Because if they're not doing right, we ought to vote their ... out. Secondly, prison-based education is the single most effective tool for lowering recidivism. We have to, especially when we have a millage that will allow us to put education back in the school, in the prisons, we have to do that. One of my former colleagues, a former professor at Wayne State, he passed a couple years ago. I met him, and if you ever get an email from me, it says, at the bottom of my email, it says, those who won't teach you right won't treat you right. I got that from him. But he earned his PhD in prison. And the reason they took the books out is because you cannot control a mind that thinks for itself. The third thing, it is incumbent upon us to reach out and reach back. Those of us who have learned how to navigate these systems, we can't afford not to go back and talk to our young people. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote this essay in 1905, called The Town of the Tenth, and he says this, and I quote, and I'm closing. The Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. Now, the training of men is difficult, and it is an intricate task. If we make money the object of man training, we shall develop money makers, but not necessarily men. If we make technical skills the object of education, we may possess artisans, but not necessarily men. Men we shall have only as we make manhood the object of the work of our schools, and intelligence the goal, that broad sympathy for knowledge and information of the world as it was and as it is, and the relationship that we have with man is the goal of a curriculum of higher education. End quote. Our job is to educate these young people so that they don't make the same mistakes that we've made. We have to challenge our teachers to teach our students to read. I have students in some of my classes who cannot read my textbooks. They should not be allowed to come home and play on their computer when they're not reading a book. If they're in 7th or 8th or 9th grade, they should be reading a book a month. When they get to high school, they should be reading 2 books a month. When they get to college, they should be reading a book a week. Because if we're spending that kind of time on these cell phones, we can spend that kind of time exercising our minds. Thank you.
So what a very modest introduction of yourself, Dr. Stevenson. We truly appreciate your experience and your knowledge and the depth of that, and that you're sharing that with us tonight, as well the others. I think they all gave themselves very modest introductions, so thank you. And feel free after Dr. Santiago Valles completes, if there's something else that you want to recap, and the same for you at the end of this portion of our program to let me know, and we can definitely revisit that, because you were talking a lot of things very quickly, but very eloquently. Thank you. Tyler?
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation to share in this political education session. This is very different than schooling, and it's very different than higher schooling, which is called in this country university. The approach I use to make the connections of this evening between mass incarceration and mass deportation is my training in political economy and cultural history, and I'm going to read in order to be as brief as possible. Is my training in political economy and cultural history, which leads to always ask the following questions. Who owns the property that produces profits? B, the policy decisions that both reproduce unequal relations of power and institutionalize unequal access to resources and services. And that's why I don't have much faith in voting, unlike my colleague. C, how the unpaid work that produces such an economic, cultural, media, and military regime which exists in this country is justified. To do this kind of work, to answer these questions, I do research about the places where the formerly enslaved people of African origin have abolished slavery, not only across the Americas, where there are 4 to 5 times as many of us as there are inside the United States, but also in self-emancipated countries in Africa, like Algeria and Eritrea, and in Asia, like Vietnam. And also, I do research about the memories that allow us to struggle for our own liberation instead of working to make our enemies rich, or instead of imitating the solutions imposed on us by our enemies. That's what I do, like I said earlier, at the University of Michigan with the work I do around Malcolm X's life, what I do at the National University in Senegal, where I teach about the writings of Frantz Fanon and Amilcar Cabral. And I'm also a researcher at the Cabral Foundation in Cape Verde, and the work I do at the National Institute of History in Havana around the writings of Antonio Maceo, who's the most important black general in the independence armies in Cuba. For our purposes here tonight, the goal is to encourage the audience to leave with the following questions in mind. This is the pedagogical strategy that I suggest for this evening. Who are our friends and who are our enemies? And what's the basis of the conflict that divides our friends from our enemies? Is it race, class, gender, nationality, or zip code? Second question, how have our enemies profited from the conditions in which we have been forced to live, whether in the colonies inside this empire or in the colonies outside this empire, whether it's in the ghettos, the barrios, the Indian reservations, or whether it's in Hawaii or Puerto Rico or Guam or the Virgin Islands, which are the external colonies of this empire. Third question, what did our ancestors do to defeat our enemies and abolish those conditions? Why is it that in the American university system and in the American public school system, you don't ever hear about the Haitian Revolution, you don't ever hear about the Mexican Revolution, you don't ever hear about the maroon communities in Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil, which defeated slavery? I don't think there is much to be proud of in running away from your slave masters in the Underground Railroad, as opposed to defeating your slave masters and abolishing slavery with your own guns and creating free territories, as we have done in Brazil, in Haiti, in Cuba, in Mexico, in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Venezuela, and in Panama. The fourth question is, what are we to do now, and what is the basis of the alliances and coalitions needed not to win elections, but to change the relations of power? And now I'm going to quote a Puerto Rican sister from New York City who's a professional politician. There is no red or blue, there's no race or class, but race, class, and gender solutions. There's no left or right, but only top and down, but only top and bottom without win-win options. There's no such thing as a win-win solution where those people at the top and those people at the bottom are equally satisfied with a solution to a problem of unequal relations of power. Since we live in a censored commercial media environment in this country, some of what I say here may be new or even challenge what you have access to in Grand Rapids. The so-called global war against terrorism is the pretext for both mass deportation and mass incarceration. And this mythology is spread without identifying the premises of globalization, which began in 1430 when the Portuguese invaded what is now called Morocco, or when the Spaniards invaded what is now called the Bahamas. Neither is are the premises of permanent war discussed, or the definition of terror. It's supposedly good for the American empire to have nearly 1,000 military bases around the world in order to prevent Russia, China, and Iran from acquiring sovereign control over the landmass in Europe and Asia. Nor are the terms of this discussion defined to our satisfaction. Terms like geopolitics, like war, like terror, like the prison industry, and above all, like exploitation and the militarization of public spaces and the economic apartheid that we have to put up with in the United States, and this minority regime that we live under, or explaining the historical context, which is what I was asked to do here tonight. let me give one example of the vocabulary that we need to redefine in our own interest as opposed to parroting the definitions that are provided for us by the schools and by the commercial media monopolies. And you can talk about media monopolies here in Grand Rapids much better than I can. What's the difference between being a refugee, being an immigrant, being an exile, and being a person of the African diaspora? Our ancestors were kidnapped in West Africa and brought to the Americas against their wishes to work for free. And if any of you think that because you earn a salary, you're no longer a slave, let me suggest to you that in the question and thank you. Those are the people who clapped have taken political economy classes. I'd like to suggest that in the question and answer period, you ask for a definition of exploitation, because there's no profit that a capitalist can make unless the employees agree to work for free part of the day. Those hours that you're working for free, you're also a slave, as am I. Back to the historical context for this global and permanent war, which is the context for mass incarceration and mass deportations. Between the 1890s and the 1930s, the American empire organized over 30 coups, occupations, military invasions in Latin America. And let me just circumscribe myself mostly to Latin America, because it's where the foot of the American empire has been in the longest. But I could, again, in the question and answer period, also give examples from the 50 countries in which the American empire has military bases in Africa, as well as the same in Asia, where the American military complex has bases in Japan, in Okinawa, which is a colony of Japan, as well as in the Philippines and in Australia and in Indonesia, excuse me. During the 1920s, and I'm going to go back and forth between Latin America and Michigan just to put this in a historical sequence. During the 1920s, Michigan was a pioneer in eugenics, which is the scientific extermination of unwanted people, long before the Nazis did it. In Battle Creek, they were funding endowed chairs of eugenics in most of the major universities across the United States. And if you eat Kellogg's Corn Flakes, you're still an accomplice to that mess. Okay. And fascism was also present in the United States in the 1930s, when, according to Smedley Butler, who's a general in the Marine Corps, 3 of his fellow officers were invited by the corporate monopolies in the United States to stage a Nazi coup in this country. And those generals included General MacArthur and General Eisenhower. I cannot remember the name of the third, but I encourage you to read Smedley Butler's book. Henry Ford had factories that included goon squads that were asked to assassinate the people who tried to organize labor unions. And he also funded a Catholic priest who was the precursor to Rush Limbaugh in the Detroit area. And he also set up a ghetto for his black workers, as well as a ghetto for his white workers. The black ghetto is called Inkster, and the white ghetto is called Dearborn, which is where I teach. In 1937, there was a sit-down strike in Flint, which you seldom hear about in the public schools in Michigan. And in 1938, Malcolm X's mother, Louise Little, was caged for 25 years in the state hospital in Kalamazoo. In 1942 to 1943, there were racist programs by whites that invaded the black neighborhoods in Michigan, not just in Detroit, but in several other cities. And in 1967, there was an urban rebellion in Detroit, and 2 organizations sprung up that year that I encourage you all to look into in order to figure out how we can address the problems of mass incarceration and mass deportation. One of them, which is the most important labor organization in the history of this state, is the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and the other is the Black Workers Congress. And in 1968, Michigan did the same thing that they did last year. They voted for George Wallace, which is Donald Trump's predecessor, which suggests to me that voting is kind of useless if what you're interested is in changing the relations of power as opposed to just changing the face of the corporate puppet that governs you. I've never understood why the cows vote for the butcher. Between the 1930s and the year 2000, with the pretext of a war against communism first, and later a war against drug cartels, the United States managed to impose military bases in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa, to set up torture schools like the United States Pentagon has had in Panama since 1945, where they trained death squads against any opposition and in defense of U.S. banks, the agricultural, industrial, and commercial monopolies of the United States, including Amway, that demanded the criminalization of labor unions and political parties, that demanded censored media across the Americas, and that demanded the bankruptcy of the local competition against the American monopolies, all this with the help of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, all three of these financial networks controlled by the American Treasury Department, which forced, in order to get loans from the IMF and the World Bank, forced currency devaluations, the elimination of tariffs on US imports, the sale of public services to foreigners, the reduction of government spending, the reduction of wages, the increase on food prices, and made it possible to repatriate the profits of American monopolies across Latin America, Africa, and Asia without ever having to leave any of this money in a national bank. Our countries were forced to open their stock markets to direct foreign investment so that American bankers could devaluate the currency of any country in Asia, Africa, or Latin America artificially, and to force the deindustrialization so that the only way to gain access to international currency is to sell our natural resources. All this amounts to recolonization, re-enslavement, and dispossession in the foreign as well as in the domestic colonies. A good case is in Detroit, and the next case will be in Chicago when Illinois and Chicago go bankrupt. But if you notice, the excluded, the marginalized, the landless are forced to stay and to die at home, while the merchandise and the investment dollars can move globally. And more recently, since 2008, and I'm only using 2008 in the interest of saving time, the United States government has sponsored coups, invasions, and electoral interventions in Honduras, in Haiti, in Paraguay, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Puerto Rico, in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Colombia, in Peru, and in Ecuador. There's a postdoctoral student at George Mason University who's taken the time to conduct an inventory of all the times that the United States has intervened in foreign elections between 1945 and the year 2000,
Yep.
and it's 3 times as often as the Russians.
Yep.
Let me repeat that.
Yep.
Between 1945 and the year 2000, the CIA and your political police, the FBI, has intervened in the elections of nearly 89 countries where the Russians have done it. I'm not apologizing or approving of any of this, but they've only done it in about 35 countries. So why the hell do you all think you have the moral standing to be upset because the Russians have intervened in your elections? especially when Mrs. Clinton intervened in the Russians' election to attempt to overthrow Putin. What goes around comes around, doesn't it?
Yes.
And the chickens do come home to roost.
Woo.
As Malcolm X taught us.
Yes.
So tonight's topic is the relation between enslavement, migration. Oh, let me say something else. In Africa, the Pentagon found an Uncle Tom general to create an organization called AFRICOM. And the American Pentagon has military bases in 50 out of 54 countries in Africa. And Obama, who's a Republican in blackface, even created a country in Africa. Obama created a country called South Sudan, just like Teddy Roosevelt created a country called Panama. So back to the relation between enslavement, migration, prisons, and deportations. As the brother said, check the 13th Amendment, because slavery is still legal in the United States. And try to make, as we'll hopefully do in the discussion, grasp an understanding of the definition of exploitation, to understand that slavery is still part of the way profit is made in this country. Second notion is this concept of migration, again, different than exile and different than refugee and different than being part of the African diaspora. When people in this country say that we're all immigrants, they don't understand very much about the history of the United States, because the indigenous people did not migrate.
Yeah.
And those of us who are of African origin, we are not immigrants. And those of us who are exiles, we don't come here because we like your weather. In the Caribbean, the less clothes you wear, the more honest you're supposed to be. The Pentagon supported, with regards to this issue of migration, since the 1960s, the wars of national liberation against American neo-colonial regimes and against the Pentagon-supported military dictatorships have produced hundreds of, or thousands of immigrants. I'll just mention one case that was produced by Oliver North and Ronald Reagan during the 1980s. They had a scheme called the Iran-Contra scheme, which made it possible to sell weapons to Iran in violation of American laws, to, with the profits from that, buy weapons for the mercenaries that the United States was running against Nicaragua from Honduras, and with the profits from that, so that the CIA airplanes did not return to the United States empty, to buy cocaine from the Colombian cowboys and then sell it in the ghettos of the United States. Don't take my word for it. Look up in the San Jose Mercury the stories by Gary Webb, who in retaliation was mysteriously died. And I know enough grammar to notice that to note that I'm not using English correctly, but he died a natural death, because it's natural that if somebody puts a bullet in your head, you should die. And lastly, the prison industry and the detention centers in this country operate in collusion or in complicity with the courts and with the police departments and with the militarization of public spaces, so that we stay inside and not talk to each other.
Yes.
All of this is done to exclude those who are then spit out of the prisons and the detention centers, to make it impossible for these sectors of the population to attend school, to have access to public housing, to have access to employment, to vote if you think that's useful, and to benefit the merchants that service the prisons with uniforms, with food, with phones, with equipment and transportation, and also with the people who have stolen the land of the indigenous people across Michigan, especially around Jackson, where they turned useless apple farms into a maximum security prison. I suggest you look at the work of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, which is the current iteration of the Republic of New Africa. If I was an African American as opposed to a Puerto Rican, that would be the organization that I would belong to. That work with Black August, which is a network of prisoners across the United States that commemorate the assassination of George Jackson every August, and recently, this very year, organized the national strike of prisoners who are opposed to enslavement across the United States. Angela Davis works with Dylan Rodriguez and with the most celebrated political prisoner of the United States named Mumia Abu-Jamal, and I only say that because now my compatriot has been released from jail. I have a compatriot named Oscar Lopez who was in prison much longer than Mandela, but he was released, and now Mumia is the most celebrated prisoner in the state. All three of them, Dylan and Mumia and Angela Davis, say that since imprisonment or detention in the migration prisons is slavery, what ethical people should do is call for the abolition of slavery, and that means the abolition of prisons.
Yes.
And to abolish prisons means that we have to ask ourselves, what is it that prisons are for, and who profits from them, and how do we organize a society where prisons are not necessary? Those are the kind of questions that I hope we can discuss later tonight. The deportations get us back to Michigan history. Between 1929 and 1944, between 400 and 2 million Mexicans that had American citizenship were deported from the United States. And nearly 50,000 of them were deported from Michigan. With the support of the Mexican government, who thought that they would be better treated back in their country of origin than here in the United States. Now, let me jump to 2010. Youth unemployment in Michigan, and this is connected with the prison industry as well as with deportations. Youth unemployment in Michigan in 2010 was 35%. This is about the time that 1/3 of the black and brown middle class disappeared. And in 2011, 48% of the students in public schools were eligible for free lunch. That gives you a reading of where the economy of this state is not going. The following global forecast is based on a 2007 United Nations Human Development Report and an article in The Atlantic from May 2009 called The Quiet Coup, which is about how the banks of the United States staged a coup in 2008. There will be growing heat and drought, which is going to reduce the agricultural output, especially in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which are going to have to endure famines, droughts, and floods. And that's going to increase the immigration flow across the world and the refugee flow across the world. Hunger is also going to increase because the oceans are going to die because of the garbage that human beings are dumping into the ocean, especially Europeans and North Americans that can't seem to manage to do anything without plastic. The biosphere is going to be destroyed. And by the way, the monocultures that is forcing people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to just grow one crop until the soil dies, that's imposed by the agro-industry monopolies like Monsanto and Dow Chemical here in the Midwest, and Dow Chemical particularly in Michigan. I think they have their headquarters up the road in the Cal University that's in Lansing. I don't like Michigan State. Dow Chemical, I should remind those of you who are in your 20s, Dow Chemical brought us napalm, and they brought us Agent Orange, which the bright lights in that firm decided to rehearse or to experiment with in the forest in my country. That's where they did the experiments. the socioeconomic inequality between the global north and the global south is going to increase as a result, again, of the floods, the droughts, and the famine, and the depletion of the soils and the death of the oceans. And within, as well as the economic inequalities are going to grow within the global north and the global south. It's not going to be just a matter of food riots, as have existed in Africa and Latin America for the last 40 years, but also the need to have permanent war. The economy of the United States cannot operate without permanent war. And I'll be happy to explain why in the question and answer period. But let me just give you some examples. You all have cell phones, right? There's a metal in your cell phone called coltan. That metal in your cell phone has caused the death of nearly 10 million people in the Congo in wars fueled by the United States and fueled by Europe in order to get at that metal. But you all have temper tantrums about the 10 million Jews and communists and gypsies and Africans that died during World War II. An equal number of Congolese have died in the last 10 years, but you all still treasure your cell phones as if it were not the prize of a war criminal. As well as the wars, the genocidal wars in Iraq, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Yemen, which is currently being conducted, where the children are dying in significant numbers. The wars in Somalia, in Libya, again, one of President Obama's doings. Wars in Colombia, in Mexico, in Venezuela, in Haiti, in Syria, in Palestine, in the Western Sahara, in Mali, in Cameroon, and in Sudan. And I'm just talking about the wars that are going on right now. And I won't continue because there's at least 59 of them that your Special Operations Department and your Pentagon are conducting as we speak tonight. Landless peasants and war veterans will continue to migrate to urban slums that will be surrounded, that will surround walled cities where public space will be militarized while housing, utilities, transportation, and healthcare will be privatized, and all of this will be fueled by constant foreclosures, evictions, while low-intensity wars between police and subsistence criminals continue. And none of this neoliberal austerity will prevent long-term economic depressions. The current depression is scheduled to last at least another 30 years. Now, back to the national forecast in order to try and help us make the connections between mass deportations and mass incarcerations. In the next 10 years, half of the jobs that exist now are going to disappear.
That's right.
What do you do with the populations that are never going to work again? What do you do with the university students that are going to be $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in debt and are never going to find a job? That's what mass incarceration and mass deportation is for. The same way the universities are supposed to be the academic plantations where you warehouse the unemployed. African Americans and Latinos are going to become the electoral majority in the next 6 years. About the same time that the US dollar is going to be attacked by a currency backed by gold reserves. And that battle, the dollar is going to lose. And I'll be happy to explain later. In the next 10 years, 50% of the existing jobs will disappear. I thought that I would repeat that so it sinks in. By 2030, African Americans and Latinos are going to become the demographic majority in the United States, and English is going to become a minority language. By 2040, 2045, the US is going to run out of petroleum. And by 2050, there's going to be 3 times as many Latinos as African Americans inside this country. And I'm going to stick around just to dance in the streets. The relevant, and 2 more comments before I finish. The relevant alliances and solutions needed now have little to do with academic degrees because the more schooling that racialized workers have, the greater the gap of their earnings and their wealth with their white counterparts. Schooling did not change the relations of power. Again, what challenges the dominant premises? Is it to imitate what our slave masters have done? Who redefines the vocabulary? How do we address the needs of the workers and the unemployed? For that, political education is needed, and that's not the same as going to school. Political education has to do with being able to identify the relations between causes and consequences and inventing solutions for problems that you have not memorized a solution to. What are we going to do about the ownership of the land? Let me close here. I understand this country because I've studied South Africa. And like South Africa, this country is based on land theft. This country is based on genocide. This country is based on enslavement. And this country is based on atomic bomb terrorism and on a minority regime. And one of the possible solutions that you might think about is, how do we divorce ourselves from the dollar? How do we acquire energy and food self-sufficiency? Most of you have lawns in front of your yards, which is imitating British aristocracy. Why the hell don't you grow food on that land? So you can tell your boss to kiss his ass. Why don't we have a parallel healthcare system and parallel courts and learn to make more sense of our life in the context of self-emancipation inside a decadent empire without much of a future, and where the redistribution of wealth and power are more relevant than voting and sure as hell more important than recognition. Much like James Baldwin, some of us in this room have an advantage. We never believed those myths that organize an empire, that the founders were all freedom-loving heroes, that each empire is the greatest country in the world, that their armies are unbeatable, and that their diplomats are wise peacemakers, and that the preceding generations dealt honorably with those who were exterminated. Well-informed people usually dismiss the beneficiaries of any empire as the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing, while those from the colonies know more about the causes of the present crisis, and we need to use that knowledge to our strategic advantage instead of imitating our former masters. I hope this contextual overview helps in our discussion tonight, and I look forward to the discussion which will follow soon.
I don't know if we need a discussion. Hey, folks, I want to, once again, thank you so very much. I've been to Dr. Let me grab the name. I like to say the name correctly. Dr. Stevenson, when he was talking about a cell phone, I wasn't playing with my cell phone. I was posting on Facebook. Folks, you better tune in because we're getting knowledge here. And so I want to thank you guys so very much for what you've shared with us, the information that you've shared. But at this point in our program, we're going to go to some pre-selected questions between the moderators. The other way? Somebody said, you want to do something different? Did I hear that? Okay, then we'll stick with this. So we have the co-moderators will ask the panelists 3 to 4 pre-selected questions. And so I'll allow first our other moderator.
Thank you, Tyrone. I want to say before we move further, I would find it difficult to be sitting next to Dr. Stevenson and Dr. Santiago Valles if I was a panelist. So to the other panelists here, you probably looked over the questions, and we're going to start with a simple one. So, and it's one that everyone can answer because some of the pre-selected questions that our group decided on, may be very specific to a certain role in the community or an organization. So again, everybody just take a deep breath. Nobody's going to be graded here, and what we're doing is imparting knowledge into our community and into our own selves. So I'll start with this question. How has mass incarceration and or mass deportation detention affected children? Because we're big adults here, but how do these issues affect children? And anybody on the panel is welcome to start.
Absolutely. So from an immigration standpoint, at the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, we represent all children that are in federal custody in the state of Michigan in their immigration proceedings. So by the time the children arrive here in Michigan, they are en route to deportation. They are in removal proceedings. The government is prosecuting them for deportation. From the kids, from the perspective of children who are currently detained, I would say most of them, I mean, especially in the context of family separation, they were ripped apart from their parents. And my heart breaks because to me it's not a news story, to me it's faces, and to me it's names. During the family separation crisis, I would meet with the children once they had arrived in Michigan, and I would do a Know Your Rights presentation, and then we'd talk a little bit about their story. And there were tears and tears and tears, and there were babies that were nonverbal because they were too young to speak, 4 months old. So then we also talked with parents. What does that mean, talking with parents that are in their home country and talking with parents that are in detention? And I think the damage that was caused in those communities is irreparable. I think the pain that those families feel has lingered long past the headlines, and I think the pain, even now that the families are reunited, the scars are there, and the trauma is there. I immigrated to this country when I was 6 years old under really wonderful circumstances, and I had my parents, and that was really hard for me. There were cultural differences, and I didn't know what winter was like. I was from Colombia, and snow was strange. And I think of what it must be like for those children to be brought under such drastically different circumstances. A lot of the families that came here were fleeing violence. They were running for their lives, for their livelihood, for their existence. And I think of what that must be like to be fleeing so much trauma and violence and then be received with even more trauma and violence. And that's just one perspective. And I also think when you talk about mass deportation, it's families that are here, community members in Grand Rapids. If they are a family of mixed status and if a parent is undocumented, the harm that is done, first of all, of living in the constant fear of deportation, the constant fear of being caught, the constant fear of not knowing what's going to happen to your children if you are returned to a country that you haven't called home in who knows how long. And I think of the trauma that happens with that insecurity that is deeply seated. It's intergenerational. It's trauma that cannot be fixed. It's trauma that is heavy, and it's damage that is unnecessary. So specifically talking from the immigration standpoint, I think it's something that African American communities, I mean, in terms of your children being ripped from you when they're of age of being able to work, it's a similar fear of uncertainty and of not being able to call your family your own. So it's the same issue, it's the same feelings, it's just manifested in a different community and in a different way.
Does anyone else would like to add to that?
Too, that we're one of I think we might be the only country in the world, and the professors here next to me that know history so well could attest to this, that put children in federal custody. Like it still just blows my mind that if a child is running for their life because they come home from school and their sister has been killed, and their mother is left a note that said, if I don't have this amount of money by this time tomorrow, your other daughter will have the same fate. So that children then embarks on a journey, crosses a border, which is what, a misdemeanor? And she gets taken into federal custody. So the system is incredibly broken. And Camilla is so right that our children are so traumatized. So my work has been trying to, throughout my whole career, to try to fight against that the best I can. And I'll tell you what, in today's culture, it's gotten pretty hard. I'm pretty tired. My staff are leaving almost daily because they're like, I can't do this. Yeah. I can't do this. The system that Dr. Santiago described is too bad. It's too bad. So that's how it's affecting children, is that children are just so vulnerable. They're so vulnerable. And while over the years we have made, some strides, meaning 15 years ago, that children that were crossing and entering from the southwest border were under the Department of Justice and placed in detention centers, didn't have access to attorneys, couldn't call their parents, didn't know what was going on, released haphazardly, maybe were kept there 2 weeks, maybe they were kept there 6 months, maybe they were kept there 9 months. So very important legislation, the Flores Agreement was passed, which allowed the transfer of custody to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Is it fixed? No. Is it slightly better? Slightly. What's the Office of Refugee Resettlement doing right now, though? They're setting up these tent cities at the border, right? And so, I have just railed and argued and fought against this. And one of the things that we have done is said, at least for children under 12, can you not put them in these huge centers? At least for a baby. How about a baby? Can you at least put a baby, while you're going to keep that baby in federal custody, can you at least put that baby in the care of somebody who can take care of them until that baby can go back to where it needs to, back with mom. So that's a little bit of my perspective in terms of my work.
Why couldn't the government put that baby back in the care of their parent, though, as opposed to taking that child from their parent, deporting their parent, now their parent doesn't know if they're ever going to see that baby again, and then adoption agencies are making money off of this?
Yeah. So the family separation issue has been unbelievably horrible, under zero tolerance. We were one of the first folks to actually notice it was happening, right? So my staff were coming to me like in the fall, like November. I think I remember the first case where I remember talking to one of the workers, right?
Even back in August.
Yeah,
so August of 2017.
And I remember one of the workers coming to me and were like, Dana, like this little one was separated at the border. I was like, what do you mean they were unaccompanied? What do you mean? Because that was our work. Our work has always been with children who cross unaccompanied, who weren't with a parent. And I said, well, what do you mean? And they were like, well, they crossed with a mom, and then they separated them. And I was like, what? And so we began to track in November, in December, and it started to increase in January. February is when I just was like, I cannot take this anymore. I met with Representative Upton. I met with Amash. I met with Susan Reed and I met with Stabenow. We just met with everybody to try to explain what was going on, and nobody was listening. And finally, as an agency, I went to my CEO and I said, we have got to go to the press because this is unbelievable and nobody is paying any attention. And so we went to a New York Times reporter, and she did a story, and the whole thing just blew open. And thankfully, it ended on June 20th. Thankfully, it ended. We have not seen any cases since then, but that still doesn't mean, 2,500 kids. That should have never happened. Should have never happened.
What are we doing to put the children, reconnect the children with the parents whom they've been separated from, though? It's okay to stop it, but we also have to correct it.
Yeah, absolutely. And within our agency, we have 3 children left who need to go home. They are hopefully within a month, right? I mean, and you can talk a little bit more, if you would, about why that process has been so long. Why does it take so long? Why can't you just say, mom's here, child's here, child needs to go to mom. And so I'd love to pass the baton over to you to explain a little bit.
Absolutely. So a report recently came out from the Department of Homeland Security explaining what happened with family separation and kind of delineating how much of a mess it was. When this zero tolerance policy, so Dana's right, we started seeing cases like this, and the first one I remember was in August of 2017, where kids were separated from their mother at the border. And there was no system, right? This is deferment. This is the administration's current policy is the reason we're doing this is to get people to stop coming. So when that's your reasoning behind creating a policy that is this inhumane, and they really don't care about the kids and they don't care about the families, it was absolute chaos. There is currently, Dana alluded to this earlier, the Flores settlement, which is an agreement that the government has that says they do not detain children for immigration purposes. So a child the maximum amount of time they can be in a detention facility is 21 days. After that, they are placed in foster homes or shelters that are lower security and are more of a residential setting. What the Trump administration did with family separation is they said, okay, cool, these parents are coming with their kids. We want to criminally prosecute the parents as a way of getting them to not come back. But they couldn't put the kids in detention with them, and they couldn't do family detention. So what they said then is, okay, well, we are going to make these children unaccompanied children, which automatically puts them in a process that was set up for a completely different set of children. And then what happened is it was chaos. So the parents are in removal proceedings across the country. If you've ever called a detention facility trying to contact someone, it would take me 2 weeks to speak to a supervisor at a detention facility to coordinate a call with the parent. And it was happening basically when the zero tolerance policy was enacted. It blew up, and there was no processes set in place. The results that we have gotten have been thanks to the ACLU's work on a case known as Ms. L. It's a litigation that happened nationwide, and any child that was separated from a parent, the parent was automatically a class member. So that's when we got the deadlines of children have to be reunified by these dates. And we saw a lot of fudging. We saw a lot of processes that didn't make a lot of sense from an immigration standpoint, so procedures were kind of fudged and things were kind of messed around, but ultimately, the things that have kept us from reuniting kids in a quicker manner is that these children are in removal proceedings and they have to go to court. And immigration courts are backlogged. And so we did several complaints. For one of the children who was here, we did a motion to terminate her proceedings before she had to appear in court. It's something that's unfair. It's something we argued against from the very beginning, and it's something that if a parent was still in the United States, they were released to them before July 26th was the deadline. But
do you see the difficulty in what you're saying, though, as far as what we've done? And that is that it's hard enough when parents who have a language barrier are asked to go to court and then lied to and sign off rights that they shouldn't have to, but to bring a 3-year-old inside of a court and try to then exercise their right when the parent themselves can't understand. I'm really, Dr. Santiago, and it goes to what Dr. Stevenson said too in relationship to everything being a commodity. These children became commodities. They became the Cabbage Patch, the in thing for some individuals who were desperate for adoption. These children became commodities for them because there was no shortage of parents who were willing, or homes that were willing to take these children in. They were kidnapping another person's child. I'm sorry, Dr. Santiago.
I think it's important for us to distinguish the consequences, which is what we're talking about now, and make the connection with the causes. I think the last statement that you made about turning human beings into merchandise has to do with the causes. We live in an economic regime called neoliberalism, which turns everybody into a commodity and which turns even our personal relations into merchandise. And so we have to understand that. Second, we have to understand that the United States, thank God, is only one of 200 countries in the world. And in order to address this, if you try to address torture inside the courts of a dictatorship, how far do you think you're going to get? You're not going to get anywhere.
Right, exactly.
In order to address this efficiently, it has to be taken to the International Criminal Court. This is a crime. It has to be taken to the International Court of Human Rights. These are human rights violations. And it has to be taken to the International Court of Justice. Now, there are 42 treaties, international treaties, that the United States has not signed since 1930. 16 of those treaties, 1/3 of them, I just counted them, have to do with the rights of children and the rights of women. And the United States government does not think, and it has not thought for the last 100 years, that children or women have any rights. And you don't have to read today's newspapers to confirm what I just said. You have to look for the list of these treaties that the United States has not signed since 1930. In the United Nations, there are people who are reporters on human rights. There are people who are reporters on children's rights. If you want this addressed here in Mississippi North, called Michigan, you have to take it to the international sphere, because inside a dictatorship, torture is legal. Inside a dictatorship, kidnapping is legal. Those of us who are of African origin are quite familiar with kidnapping, which is what happened to our ancestors. We are quite familiar with children being separated from their parents, which not only happens today, but is the way labor is organized in this country. It has been organized for the last 400 years. In Latin America, for the last 500 years. This is not something new. This is the way profit is made inside this economic regime.
You know, I want to bring Mr. Reyes in. Mr. Reyes is a volunteer with, help me out, Mr. Reyes, volunteer with Movimiento
Cosecha.
Okay. Director of Community Engagement. You've seen some of what we're talking about. Talk to us about how your organization is engaged in some of the activity that you are and some of the things that you see as a result of your role.
Well, Movimiento Cosecha, we started is a movement that started about 3-4 years ago, and it started because this is something that's been ongoing. I know that recently the separation of families and children was what brought the immigration to the forefront, like mainstream, really. But what's happened since is that Movimiento Cosecha started realizing that through politics, nothing was getting done. Democrats and Republicans alike were making promises to the immigrant community and using us. The Democrats were using us to get elected. Obama used us to get elected, and when he got elected, he started deporting us more than any other president. Now, after that, what Movimiento Cosecha decided to do is bypass government and start mobilizing communities. And what we've started doing here locally is getting our community together to bring that locally. So, for example, we have a couple of initiatives that I mentioned at the beginning. Is ending the contract with I.C.E. How do we hold local government accountable for how they are complicit with the structure, with the problems that are being discussed? Mm-hmm. How is our local government at all levels complicit with I.C.E., which is an organization that was founded 15 years ago, which does not need to exist and has gone astray? Right. And how do we hold our elected officials accountable? If this is something that when we discuss it here, it sounds hopeless, really, right? It's really depressing, all this structure that's in place just to keep us down. Mm-hmm. How do we make changes, how to bring this about? And what we believe at the Movimiento Cosecha is that everything is in community. We we can bring about this change with us and the people and with our allies. And we've brought together a lot of community organizers. We've brought the people that impact the community. And what we've started doing is showing up to the Kent County Commission meetings, for example, to end the contract with I.C.E. And we want to hold them accountable for, we want to hold them accountable for how they're complicit with I.C.E. Because this is something that is happening locally here, although it's been a national concern. It's happening here. It's been happening here locally, and our families are being separated. They're being torn apart. This contract with I.C.E. There's a narrative that's in place right now, or that people want to promote, that local government has no power to change that. And we know that it is not true. We know that local government there is an elected official, the Sheriff Stelma. One individual has made a decision on behalf of our entire community based on this is how he put it, his oath to protect the Constitution means working with all law enforcement agencies. So this one individual took it upon himself to decide for the entire county that our values are to sacrifice the safety, the well-being, and he thought it was better to have our families, our immigrant community, be afraid, drive scared, that it was his decision to make, and to have a contract with I.C.E. and to tear our families apart. And so that's what we've been doing with Movimiento Cosecha. We want to bring awareness about this. I'm sorry I get emotional because this is something that impacts me and impacts my community.
Don't apologize. Don't. You're all right. You're among family here.
Thank you. Back to your question, Movimiento Cosecha, we're organizing our communities. We're bringing the impacted community voice to the forefront. We've challenged the status quo, the system. We've realized that the traditional sense of bringing about change through politics is broken. It's not working. Maybe it is working for the people that it's intended. The people that are meant to be at the table are at the table. Those white people are the ones that show up to the Kent County Commission. Those are the commissioners that represent us in the county. And our community is not represented, and we need to change this process and challenge it at all levels, and that's what Movimiento Cosecha is doing, and it's working, and our allies are seeing it, and there's tremendous momentum being built, and the community is listening. Nonprofits are hearing us. Like I said, allies, and we have significant movement, and if you want to connect with Movimiento Cosecha after this, there's a few representatives of Movimiento Cosecha here that we can talk to you more about after.
Okay, Ms. Rivera, I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to shut up, okay? But we have actually, I believe she's going to be the only sheriff for our county in the state of Michigan at November, is it, Ms. Young? She's taking Sheriff Stelma's place. Okay? And so what I'd like, here's my question. I got two questions for you. And like I said, I'm going to shut up for Ms. Rivera. The first question is, are you going to continue that relationship with ISIS? And the second question is it ICE?
Yes.
Okay, I'm talking Greek ISIS and stuff, huh?
Immigration.
Mythology.
Yeah, it's Immigration and
I.C.E.
Customs Enforcement.
Okay, ICE, yeah. And then the second question is, what threat do some of our immigrant community, what threat do they have that we feel it necessary to bring the federal government in to create a police state and invade unnecessarily in their privacy?
Okay, so I'm not a representative of ICE, and I don't advocate to know how or why or when or for what purposes they're doing enforcement. But it's a complicated question that I think I need to do a little bit of background information for.
Okay.
So the sheriff's oath of office is to uphold local, state, and federal laws, and I think that's, everybody would understand that that's what a sheriff does. A sheriff is a constitutional officer, which means he doesn't get his authority from Michigan laws or federal laws. He gets it from the Michigan Constitution, and it also has a lot of historical ties back then. I'm sure you guys could agree there are a lot of historical ties for a sheriff's office. So the federal laws that he supports doesn't mean that he has authority to directly enforce federal laws. And in fact, we don't.
No, that's right.
We
Exactly,
don't.
yeah.
We enforce state laws and local laws. But we specifically have to support federal agents acting in a lawful way to carry out their duties. An example of this might be if there's a bank robbery down the street, that's typically going to be investigated, and any arrests that will happen from the federal government. Typically would be an FBI arrest. It would get prosecuted through the federal court system. But while somebody is going through the court proceedings, they would be housed in a local jail under the authority of the sheriff. So it seems like an easy way to put it. It's a little bit more complicated when you start dealing with ICE, because there are some technicalities with ICE that make them different than the FBI or the DEA or some of the other federal agencies. And there's a lot of legal discussion nationally, not just here locally, but nationally regarding this issue. And many sheriffs are taking different directions on it. Many of those proceedings are going through the court systems, and there's more specific direction coming all the time. So,
But you gave the example of the bank robbery.
Mm-hmm.
The sheriff doesn't investigate the bank robbery. The FBI does.
right, and we
So-
don't make ICE arrests either. So
Exactly,
that's the
but we're still,
correlation.
but we're sharing information.
Well, so let me explain how that happens. And again, one of the points that I want to get back to have to do with some of the responsibilities we have. When somebody is arrested for any purpose, anywhere in the state of Michigan or throughout the nation, they are fingerprinted. Fingerprint is the foundation for their identification in the criminal justice system. So as soon as they're brought into custody, as soon as administratively possible, they're fingerprinted. By law, that fingerprints get sent to the state database and automatically to the federal database. When it hits the federal database, it goes to the Department of Homeland Security. And this process was developed as an anti-terrorist approach, so that people who were on the watch list could be identified when their fingerprints hit the database. It is an automatic system, and it happens virtually within 30 seconds of the time somebody's been fingerprinted. Those fingerprints have been submitted. When it hits Homeland Security, there can be alerts that will come about because of the way their database works. And again, I don't represent ICE. I can't answer those questions. I wish they were here to answer those for you. But they identify people of interest by the fingerprints. Locally, we don't have any ability to enforce immigration status. We do nothing to pick up the phone call and say, you know, this person claims to be of Mexican birth or of European birth. No, we don't do any of that. This is simply a fingerprint process that we don't really have any impact on. If we are contacted by ICE, just like on a parallel, if we're contacted by the DEA or we're contacted by the FBI when somebody is in custody and they have the proper authorization, i.e. a warrant, then we will hold a person for their process. We would do it on any federal entity. So that's the process that's happening. The specific ICE contract, and there are multiple different types of ICE contracts that a sheriff's office can have. Some of those ICE contracts, they could sign a contract to go out and do ICE enforcement. That is happening in this country. It is not happening in Kent County. Will never happen in Kent County. It's not something we have any interest in. Understand how much damage that would do to our community. So we don't have that type of contract, but the contract we do have really has a couple factors. There's three primary factors to it. It sets up conditions of incarceration. That's not really paramount in Kent County, because I'll tell you, in our correctional facility, we run a constitutionally correctional facility, and I don't really believe we need an external contract to say that we're going to feed inmates properly and we're going to give humane services and medical attention. But those are some of the things that are in the ICE contract. The ICE contract also sets up conditions about how long ICE would have to come and process the person while they're in our custody. Without that contract in place, there is inherently a 48-hour process. The contract allows for 72 hours. And frankly, the sheriff's perspective in signing the contract in the initial stages back in 2012, again, this is an older agreement that's been in place, was to allow that person to be in community for a little bit longer so that the family would have an opportunity to potentially be in contact with them while they were still in custody here locally. But again, the difference with the contract is 72 hours. Without the contract, it's 48 hours. Either way, with or without the contract, the person's still held on the authority of ICE. The third thing that it does is allows for reimbursement of the cost to the community for the incarceration. Incarceration is somewhat expensive for a community. In Kent County, any entity who lodges somebody at the Kent County Correctional Facility is charged, and we get reimbursement for what? It's not a profit. In fact, we don't even collect enough to fully reimburse, but it is pretty close from what it actually costs us to house somebody on average. But those are the things that the contract does. So that's kind of the bigger issue around the contract and why it's not as easy to say yes or no. If we don't have the contract, the situation will not truly be impacted in Kent County, in that somebody will still be retained by virtue of them being alerted, ICE being alerted from the fingerprint submission. They'll still be detained. They would still be subject to the process. And in some regards, there's a loss of opportunity to be detained locally, although, I mean, I understand that's very limited in its benefit. But I think the broader issue that I think is really important is I understand that there's a lot of different ways that people make change and have historically made change, and it's been a very strong learning experience this evening listening to the different approaches. And I think as a sheriff's department, you obviously know we run a correctional facility, but we also have police that do law enforcement directly. You know, often we're called to stand by when people are protesting and to make sure the public safety is continued. So, and I think we can attest to the fact that we've stand by through many of these protests that are about us, and stood by and protect the rights of everybody to say what they want to say and to try to make the change in the way that they see appropriate. I think that's an important process in the United States. I think it's one of the things that sets us aside in the United States, and I proudly protect anybody to do it. But there are other mechanisms of change, and I don't know if you guys have picked up on how many times the word policy is being used in this conversation. Policy is not law. Policy is vulnerable to being changed every change of administration as time goes. So we can do everything and change policy, but if we are not pushing to change the law, constitutionally correct, legally correct institutions will really have not as much recourse to help as what we would be able to do if we were able to change the law. So I'm advocating that when change is needed, and change is needed, that we also continue and consider formal processes in addition to your informal processes.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make one point that I think is important for all of us to perhaps look into and maybe research, is that every agency that was mentioned just now, FBI, CIA, police department, sheriff department, those are criminal justice systems. Immigration is a civil system. So in there lies the conflict. So I think that's the opportunity for our community here, is to restructure power in the context of understanding the system needs reform as stated here, but those are two very different tracks. And I think that's where all the politics overlies it. but we have work to do in our community, definitely. We have taken some time from the public comment section, so I'm very sorry about that. I'm good with keeping it going, of course. So at this time, I want to open it up to public audience comments. If you're willing to come forward, the microphone's right here, and you can direct your question to one person on the panel or open it up.
But don't direct any of your questions to the moderators.
Any questions? Oh, good, yes. Come on up. Come on down.
Yes, my question is, Dr. Stevenson, you touched on it, but the other panelists might have some information they'd like to share as well about the correlation between education and our children being put in the criminal justice system. You know, we know it's obvious, but maybe you can touch on that and expound on that a bit more.
Yeah, thank you. Couple things. I would say, first of all, that the educational system in the U.S. has never been designed to educate black people and brown people. But beyond that, when we send our children to school, we have to also understand that, especially for young black boys and young brown boys, as they begin to grow older and they become more aggressive and creative and want more answers, they are oftentimes feared. Dr. Jawanza Kunjufu wrote a series of books entitled The Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. And one of the things he argues is that young kid that sat in the front of the class in the first and second grade, by the time he got to the fourth or fifth grade, because he's getting taller, he's thinking more, he's raising his hand more frequently, etc., if the teacher is unable to understand he wants to learn and he begins to condescend, he starts backing up. And what the research showed was that these kids, by the time they get to the sixth or seventh grade, no longer desire education. They no longer feel like they want to be a part of the class because they're being sent to the principal's office because the teacher's afraid of them or the teacher sees them as a threat. So what we have to be able to do then is, one, make sure that these teachers don't send our kids to the principal's office. That we challenge the school system to hire teachers who have the ability to do intercultural and cultural competent teaching. Two, we as parents have to be more involved in our students' education. There's no way that a kid should come home from school, in elementary school, junior high school, or high school, and not at least spend an hour or so doing some kind of homework. If the teacher didn't give them some, we should give them some. If nothing else, they learn study habits. And so, you know, I think it's important that we understand that the role of education is not just to provide information. It is to teach us to think critically so that we can become critical, contributing members of society. It's like Dr. Santiago Valles just said. You know, if we don't understand that the dictator likes us being impotent, then we'll fall in line. And one of the questions I would have to ask for the group here is, you know, the NAACP, Dr. Barber says, we don't have permanent enemies, we don't have permanent friends. We have permanent issues. We have permanent interests. How can the black and brown communities coalesce so that we can use the power necessary to change these systems? I think it's not just about being better educated. I think it's about bringing a level of power across our community lines so that we become a threat to the dictator. So I hope that answers your question.
So, Michelle? I just wanted to make a couple points. We have several programs in the correctional facility, and the programs that really help to develop critical thinking have been statistically by far the most effective at helping people to stay away from incarceration in the future, to reduce recidivism. And typically those programs, when they're taught by people who have walked in their shoes, had some of the same life circumstances, had some of the same contacts even with law enforcement, if they participate in helping people to develop that critical thinking, it's even more successful. So I agree completely. Education is so important, obviously, before we get to the incarceration process, but even lifelong, as people continue to develop, they're never done developing. And if we stop pouring resources into developing people, we will see an incarceration state not only continue but grow.
Can I say one more thing? We've closed school. I've been here. I moved here from Los Angeles. So I've been here like 18 years. We've closed schools in Grand Rapids. There are inner city schools that don't have after-school programs. They don't have cultural programs. They don't have music. They don't have art. You can drive 6 miles down the road to Byron Center. They have an entire building for performing arts. Now, why is that? Okay? Here's the second thing. When we talk about critical thinking, what we have to understand is a significant portion of our students are being challenged to memorize information to pass standardized tests. They're not being taught how to think. Because even in my classroom, they're not. They're not being taught to think, because I use a critical pedagogical teaching method. So I facilitate conversation in the class through dialogue. And when I ask the students questions, it's like foreign to them that someone's concerned about what they think about the data. So we have to make sure that if the teachers are not challenging them, we have to challenge them and give them permission not only to think, but to think differently.
Dr. Santiago Valles? And then Sergio.
I studied with Paulo Freire for about 20 years, and we ran seminars together in Puerto Rico. The pedagogical strategy that Paulo proposed is very similar to that which Malcolm X proposed, to that which Che Guevara proposed, and to that which Amílcar Cabral proposed. And it's very important to understand, like Brother Malcolm said, that if you send your children to the schools run by your enemies, you're going to have your enemy sitting at your supper table every night. Unless we run parallel schools that challenge the premises of the dominant society, the schools are going to spit out obedient slaves, mute workers, and prisoners, because there's a connection between the way the schools run in this country, the public schools run in this country, and the prison industry. Yes. There's a sister who now works at City University of New York named Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who wrote a book called Golden Gulag. In California, they can plan the building of prisons on the basis of the 3rd and 4th grade reading test results. Now, public schools and prisons are part of the same system. If we do not have the capacity to organize public schools, our own parallel schools, the public school system will domesticate our children. And there's a difference between schooling and education. A school classroom is a place where there's a monologue. And education is a place where there's conversation. And there's conversation about the following, according, again, to Paulo Freire, Che Guevara, Amílcar Cabral, and Malcolm X. We have conversations about what I said at the outset. What's the difference between our friends and our enemies? Who are our enemies? What have our enemies done to us? What obstacles do we have to overcome in order to abolish, not reform, not vote for the next cow, not vote for the next butcher as happy domesticated cows, but how do we abolish the conditions under which we have been forced to live against our wishes? And how do we invent a society where there's no exploitation? How do we do that? And then how do we verify our ideas by putting them into practice? That's what education is about. And I do not know of too many universities or public schools in this country where the students are asked to verify their abstract solutions in the streets. And you might be surprised to learn that you don't live in a democracy.
Sergio.
I wanted to bring back the conversation about to how black and brown can work together.
Wait, Mr. Red, let's let her ask her question and come on in after that, okay? We want to get Q&A.
Okay, and it's not so much a question, but a comment as far as why politicians might not be shaking in their boots to listen to us. And that's the main issue in Michigan as far as gerrymandering. So for those of you who do not know about the Voters for Not Politicians, I would encourage you to go on their website to learn about gerrymandering and also research Proposal 2, because we were able to get enough signatures to put that on the ballot in November to end gerrymandering in Michigan. So research that proposal, and we hope we get your vote.
Is there a question?
No, that's the
Okay,
statement.
Sergio. Yeah. Sergio.
I wanted to bring the conversation back to how black and brown can work together around this, and the title of this was about the connection between modern day slavery and the industrial prison complex and mass deportations, correct? And so a lot of what's happening you asked about earlier a question about how this is impacting our children, and one thing we don't think about is the why of why so many people are being deported. There's 11 million undocumented immigrants, but we're not counting their kids. We're not counting the American citizens that have to leave this country with their parents to their parents' country of origin and have to spend their life there. And we don't know if they're going to come back, but these kids are effectively removed from the political system. They can't vote. When they get back to the U.S., if they do come back to the U.S., they have to learn about the process, how the system works here. The other part of that is that we were talking earlier about the immigration, the policies is since Jeff Sessions implemented the no tolerance policy, it's what this set in place is really the doctrine of self-deportation. What the government wants to do now, what Trump wants to do now is he wants to make this country such a bad place for immigrants that that they'll self-deport, or even those that are here legally, he's going after them now. Yep. And when we start talking about how there's profit in this to be made is that there's so many for-profit prisons now are holding facilities for immigrants that are not under the same obligations to treat immigrants as they do American citizens or American prisoners. And so that is a huge conflict of interest and a huge way for the industrial prison system is profiting off of brown bodies or immigrant bodies, and they keep them here. Changing, entering the U.S. from a civil infraction to an actual crime triggered that process, so that now every single immigrant coming into the U.S. Illegally is now being processed, and they go into one of these holding facilities, these new holding facilities that are placed in isolation in the middle of nowhere where it's cheapest, and they bring these immigrants here where the attorneys cannot get to them, where families cannot visit them, where they stay there for indefinite amounts of time to make money and put bodies on beds so the federal government can pay for them. These are all different ways in which the government is profiting off of immigrants, and it's the same thing with other communities of color here in the U.S. And I think that's the connection between the two. What I was going to say, the reason I'm saying this is that this is one clear issue in which both black and brown have a vested interest, and that we need to start coming together to be at the table, not waiting for each other to reciprocate. Yep. But actually being the first to step up and go to each other's rallies, go to each other's,
That's what we're doing here tonight, right?
Yes.
Sergio? Exactly. Is there a question out in the audience over here? Kathy?
Okay. I can't really speak for everybody in the room, but I feel like there's a general consensus that everybody that's here are people who care about these issues. How does this carry out of this room to people who need to hear this? What happens to take this to a national or even a global thing where everybody gets involved?
Dr. Santiago Valles?
I have two suggestions. First of all, I'm not very big, so I can't say I'll come and make a massive part of a street demonstration. But I have two suggestions for you to discuss with your colleagues, accomplices. I don't like the word allies. I prefer the word accomplices. First question
Point taken.
is, how do we make mass incarceration and mass deportation unprofitable?
Yes.
How do we squeeze the people who get rich from it to zero profits?
Yes.
First subject of discussion, I suggest, should be that. And the second is, how is this being addressed in other countries? And I'll make two observations, and you can adapt them to the local reality as you see fit. Both in Argentina and in Spain, there's something called scratches. And scratches are popular events that take place in the houses and in the workplaces and in the country clubs and in the summer homes of people who tortured during the dictatorship in Argentina and during the Franco regime in Spain, and since 1975 have continued to run torture chambers for the CIA inside Spain. And scratches is that you take live musicians, a play, street demonstration, leaflets and posters to the places where these profiteers from mass incarceration and mass deportation, to the places where they live, so that their neighbors can know that they're economic profiteers from somebody else's misery, or to the places where they entertain themselves in their country clubs, whether it's Meyer Gardens or wherever the DeVosses have their hellhole. And you pass out leaflets and you put up posters so that everybody in the neighborhood knows who these economic criminals are. And the other thing that I suggest you look into is, if profit is the difference between the cost of production and the sale price, how do you interrupt the flow of merchandise? And that, since the 1870s, is done with blockades. The Sandinistas did it in Nicaragua. The workers in Paris did it in 1871. Cosecha has been doing it across Michigan at least for the last 4 or 5 years. And you might consider, again, the basic question that I asked at the outset is, how do you take the profit out of mass incarceration and mass deportation? The Panthers and the Young Lords in the 1960s coined a phrase that I suggest you examine. Poverty had its pimps, and the poverty pimps were the social workers and the NGOs and the do-gooders that earned their salaries from caging people.
Thank you. Next question.
I'm sure all of you know personally that people of color are demonized in the media, specifically by white people. And I'm just asking, how can I, or as a white person, use my privilege without overstepping my boundaries? Does that make sense?
Anybody in the panel want to address that?
Something that I've found really important is creating spaces. So I think that with white privilege comes a lot of platforms in which you are heard and you are viewed in a better light than a person of color would be viewed if you were initiating a conversation. But I also think the most important thing is not speaking on behalf of people of color. So allowing people of color to speak for themselves and allowing the marginalized communities to speak for themselves and using your privilege to create a space that welcomes that in. I think one of the most important things as a co-conspirator is to listen. And as a person of color who often gets mistaken as white or misidentified as white, I think I kind of struggle or like straddle the line in being able to kind of balance both worlds. But I think that it's important to obviously acknowledge privilege, and I think that's a really important step that you've already made. But I also think that creating spaces of welcoming conversation and not using your voice, but using your place of privilege to lift others and welcome them into the conversation.
Thank you. Anybody else on the panel? Is that you?
I have an example. Movimiento Cosecha has two groups, Cosecha Allies and Rapid Response to ICE. Rapid Response to ICE is a group of allies that interrupt ICE raids or ICE when ICE shows up to people. They also work with the family after a parent or one member of the family has been taken. They go in and provide service to the family, food, shelter, money, if they need to move the family. That's how they use their privilege. Also, Cosecha Allies, they also show up in movements when we do demonstrations, when the impacted community is not able to, or is afraid, or it's at risk of possibly being arrested. Then the allies, most white people that don't have to be afraid of being arrested or possibly deported if arrested. And what's important to note here is that these are groups in which people, allies, have been, are following the lead of the impacted community, and so they follow our lead. We are the face of Cosecha movement, but they are ready to help in whatever way we ask them to help. And this has been actually very helpful. We recently had a conference where they were the ones in the kitchen cooking. They were the ones that organized a lot of things and the behind the scenes so that we could have our conference with multiple visitors from other cities. So these are examples of how allies can use their privilege to actually help in meaningful ways without overstepping.
Okay. Any question? One up back here in the back.
Hi. Several questions. I'll try to keep it to 1.5. And so my first question actually is for Bethany Christian Services. What I don't understand is how an agency that deals with adoptions and those kinds of issues ends up getting a federal contract and is now taking in children from on the border. Especially, I guess maybe I could understand it if this was Austin or Dallas, but this is Grand Rapids. So I don't even understand how you all got involved in this in the first place. And then my next question is, why would you? Especially understanding what was happening to these children.
So part of the answer to that is we are not an adoption agency. 20% of what we do is adoptions. So we are an agency that operates in 32 states and in 15 countries. So we do work around helping kids and helping families. We started refugee work in the 1970s. Gerald R. Ford at the fall of Saigon reached out to Bethany Christian Services and said, we are starting an unaccompanied refugee minors program. Would you be one of the first agencies to come alongside and help with refugee children? We said yes. And that just grew over the decades. So currently we are the largest unaccompanied refugee minors program in the country. And so in the 1980s, we started working with children from Central America. And because we had a refugee program, an unaccompanied minors refugee program, it became natural to not only work with refugee minors, but for children who, for whatever reason, they don't have refugee status, but they're refugees. So they're coming across the border and they're trying to get asylum, trying to get that status in order to remain here. And so we began our work in the 1980s. It grew in the 1990s, and it has grown throughout the decades. So our work with unaccompanied children we have a long, long history. Our work with children who are coming across the border in terms of like the recent, within the last 10 years, let me go back and explain two things. So there's two types of programs for unaccompanied children that are crossing the border, okay? The very first step is they're taken into custody and they get put in detention. Because of the Flores Agreement, they can only stay in detention under the Department of Homeland Security for 72 hours. At that point, they get transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So like I said, we've been working with ORR since the 1970s. And so they came to us in the year 2012, and they said, would you begin helping us, because we have these mass shelters around Texas, like 1,500 bed sites, in Florida, 1,500 bed sites, and we are looking for agencies who would be willing to do foster care, because these children should not be in these large detention centers. And so that was what Bethany does. Bethany does that well, and so we said, absolutely. So in 2012, we began working with unaccompanied minors who were crossing the southwest border and needing that first line of help. And that was through foster care. And so that's a very, very short process. It's not adoption. The children do not get adopted. It's called foster care because the government calls it that. It's really not. It's really a host family. The children are in care for only about 2 to 6 weeks, sometimes longer if there's complicated issues. Camilla can attest to that. But the main point of the transitional foster care program is to reunite the children with their families. And so our work is not just adoption. 20% of what we do is adoption. And our work with refugee services and immigrant services goes back many, many years.
Thank you for that clarification. Question? Yep.
Okay, I wanted to talk a little, well, I have a question, but it's a statement also. So we talked about the economic inequities here in the United States, and right now we have a higher number of workers who are working more than one job, and we're talking about these families who have one parent who are working 2 jobs, and I wanted to get back to the fact that we are not educating our kids and we aren't being involved in the schools. But when you're working 2 jobs, so this is the economic connection here with the social injustice here, because you have the parents who are working 2 jobs and raising a family so that they can have a living wage and be able to support their family, but also not being able to be involved in the school system and don't have the education to be able to help their children with their homework. And so you need the after-school programs that have been eliminated with the recent administration that we have, that now we don't have anybody helping to educate these kids or to make sure that they're getting their homework done, and then the families are falling apart. So then they fall back into the criminal justice system because nobody's home. They don't know how to get their homework done, and then we have this cycle that's happening.
Is there a question for the panel? Is there a question? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a question, but I just wanted to get to that before. I wanted to preface my question. So my question is, how do we as parents get access to the resources that you talk about here, and how do we generate funding so that we can have these programs even when the government says we're going to eliminate them? So how do we get the funding? How do we collaborate together in our communities to generate that funding and to get it back? That's my question.
Dr. Santiago Valles?
That was a great statement and a great question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
The wealth inequity in the United States is not very different than it is in Central America. The economy of this country operates like a banana republic in Central America, whether it's Honduras or Guatemala or El Salvador. A living wage in Grand Rapids, I don't know, but I can tell you what it is in Kalamazoo. A family of 4 needs to have the 2 adults making at least $22 to $25 an hour. So $7 an hour is jive, and so is $15 an hour. To live with dignity and in liberty, which is what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights demands, which is one of the few international treaties that the American government has signed, requires in Kalamazoo, again, I suspect that in Grand Rapids, since it's a bigger village than Kalamazoo, the living wage is higher. I know enough about the English language to know that this is not a city. This is a village.
Okay.
And a rather boring village at that.
We'll get you back to Kalamazoo soon.
So is Kalamazoo. Kalamazoo's even more boring.
Claro que sí.
When I want to live, I go to Chicago or to Detroit.
There you go.
Now, to answer the first part of your question about how do we get the resources, one of the ways to get the resources is to organize a time bank where people exchange hours of work with each other without needing a dollar as an intermediary. That's one way of emancipating ourselves from the master's currency. And the other, with regards to how do we organize the community so that we don't have to send our children to the slave master's schools. Audre Lorde used to say that you can't tear down the master's house with the master's tools. We need another set of tools. And if people in a neighborhood get together like they do in Detroit or like they do in Chicago in block clubs, we can have one person in the block. Notice that I didn't say a woman. We can have one person in the block do the shopping, another person in the block do the cooking, and the other people in the block do the teaching. And then we don't have to send our children to the master's schools to turn out people like they do at Western that end up being the emergency managers, that is the plantation overseers for everything that Granholm and Snyder choose. Why is it that all of the emergency managers come from that academic plantation?
No sabía. I didn't know that, but now I know.
They all come
now
from
I
there.
know.
They're domesticated because they all went to the master's schools.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go back to the back here on the left here. Go ahead.
And I think this will be we've got
Right there.
a couple more questions.
So my question is for Dr. Santiago Valles and Dr. Stevenson, because your original contextual information introduced a dichotomy of thought in my mind, which was the presence of voting in America. I'm 20 years old, and since I guess have been 7 or 8, it's been instilled in me the importance of voting. Dr. Santiago, I really appreciate your, if I may, very bleak, realistic approach to the world that we live in. And I keep going back to what you said. Why does the cow keep voting for the butcher, right? But I'd like to take that one step further, and I would say that the system we live in makes us, the cows, become the next line of butchers. And Dr. Stevenson, you're saying that there's nothing more important right now than voting. So I guess, because I love conflict, I'd like either one of you to comment. Is there a way in this system to stop ourselves from becoming the next line of butchers? Or by participating, are we all doomed to become the next line of butchers?
Okay, so
Great question.
great question. So you know your grade just went down, right? She's one of my students.
Okay. She might be vegetarian. too.
Yeah. Yeah. So here we go. Here's the first thing, and again, Dr. Santiago and I may disagree on this. I think that first of all, when we tend to think of voting primarily about voting for the president. We don't think about downline voting. We don't think about midterm voting. We don't think about the fact that we do have the capacity to put senators and congresspersons in office. And so I think that, one, not only do we have to recognize that the vote, at least in my community, people died for it. People were whipped for it. People lost their lives for it. People had their hands cut off for it. That it is a responsibility. But I also think that unless we're going to demolish the system, then the only way to change it is to be inside of it. One of the reasons I became an academic is because when I was in high school, and I graduated from high school in 1970, I had white teachers who didn't teach me anything about who I was or who I am. And what I wanted to do was change the way people were taught. So I earned 5 degrees so I could get into a place to be in the room to have a conversation. And so I think that it's okay to throw stones at the house, but occasionally, if that door opens, I'm going inside. Because if you're not at the table, you're in the menu. You know, so I think that though the electoral college needs to be demolished, I don't think that the process of voting and the ability to elect people to office who have the capacity to be in a room like a Kamala Harris, you know, needs to take place. So, you know, I'm not so sure that in the next 100 years we're going to demolish the system, but I do think that if enough people of conscience are on the ballot, if enough people are conscious, are voted into place, we can make some noise. And we see some noise being made now. So that's how I'll respond to it.
Dr. Santiago Valles?
How many of you remember what your last ballot looked like? Raise your hand if you remember what the last ballot looked like.
I got in trouble because I took a picture of it, so I do.
Did any of you see in the ballot to vote up or down who owns the land? Or who owns the banks? Or who owns the factories? Or who owns the natural resources? Those are the basis for holding and reproducing power. That's how anybody in any society becomes the dominant sector. The people in an elected parliament only need to pay attention to the people who own the land, the people who own the banks, the people who own the factories, and the people who own the natural resources. Political democracy, which you associate with representative government, is only possible if it operates in tandem with economic democracy. And in a society where wealth is concentrated in the hands of the top 1% that own as much as the bottom half of the population, political democracy and representative government is impossible. So you're wasting your time when you go to the ballot box and you don't see on the ballot the possibility of changing who owns the land, who owns the banks, who owns the natural resources, and for that matter, since some of you are university students, who owns and who makes the decisions in the knowledge-producing factories, which are the academic plantations in this country. And above all, in 2018, who owns the commercial media, where people are brainwashed into thinking that they live in freedom.
Thank you. You can see the gentleman, Mr. Bynum, leaving the room. If we could give him a round of applause for being with us as long as he could tonight. Thank you. And in the interest of time, there are other questions on the floor. Can I ask Kathy? Kathy, where are you at? Are we good with Wealthy Street here? Because we were supposed to end at 8:30. Not that your questions are not important.
I don't even know what time it is. What time is it?
It's 10 to 9.
Just the last 2 questions, that's it.
Okay. And then we have to do thank yous. Thank you. Go ahead.
So to remain on the issue of voting, I was wondering what you would think of the possibility of getting some sort of proportional representation system, either in the state legislature or in the U.S. House of Representatives, like is done in most other countries. Because I think if that were possible, then we could have at least a third party that could hold the balance of power between the other 2 major parties and could get some actual more progressive legislation.
Is that a
enacted.
question for a panelist
Yeah,
here? Okay.
that's a question, and I would also make the point that in Michigan, the law was changed so that for the third parties, the top of the ballot is the person who gets the most votes from that party. So it's not necessarily that person's candidate for governor as it used to be. So there will be people from those parties running for the state board of education and the university boards. So if we do that, then I think we could have a chance to change the conversation and change the system.
So you're talking about the parties on the ballot then?
Proportional representation.
Okay. Is that a question that we can defer to one of the panelists or after?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine.
Thank you. Because I think that's pretty specific, and I want to ask you for clarification on that. Okay? Thank you.
A question for a statement directed at Mr. Santiago. As we sit here and we talk about black and brown people coming together, figuring out ways to work together, and we're speaking about people coming across a border, escaping situations, seeking freedom. You made a statement earlier tonight about the Underground Railroad that came off to me as a bit disrespectful towards my ancestors like Harriet Tubman and others. Would you like to take a moment to clarify that statement that you made?
In the Caribbean and in Central America and in South America, there were groups of formerly enslaved descendants of Africans who emancipated themselves. That happened in Cuba, it happened in Haiti, as the first republic in all of the Americas, organized by descendants of African slaves. It happened in the Dominican Republic, in El Maniel. It happened in my own country. It happened in Mexico, in Panama, in Venezuela, Colombia, El Salvador, Guyana, Suriname, Brazil, and Ecuador. What I'm referring to is descendants of Africans, mostly from Mali and Senegal, who had 700 or 800 years experience making war, coming to the Americas and creating machines of war, where these communities were self-sufficient farmers. They had their own education system, and they had their own armies, and they were able to defeat their slave masters.
Your statement was that Harriet Tubman and people like her should have stayed behind and fought instead of fleeing using the Underground Railroad. That was your statement.
To run away. Yes, that's what I'm saying.
Right, you said they chose to run away instead of to fight.
There are examples of communities of Maroons in the United States. The Seminoles in Florida, the Dismal Swamp in Virginia, and several other communities that joined them between the period they were expelled from Florida and they ended up in northern Mexico and in the Dismal Swamp.
I'm right in that you were condemning the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman and people like her, correct?
I'm saying that it's more honorable to turn around and defeat your slave masters than it is to put distance between you and your slave masters.
Exactly. And so what do you have to say about the people that are fleeing Mexico, coming to America, looking for the same situation, looking for freedom? Should they not be fleeing Mexico? Should they be staying there to fight?
In the last 50 years, the university students and the peasants in Guerrero and in Morelos have set up communities of resistance that were self-sufficient agricultural communities that were...
Is that a yes or no, sir? Should they be staying in Mexico to fight? Yes or no?
It sounds like you two have an opportunity afterwards to continue this conversation.
For Mexicans.
I don't.
I'm just asking a simple yes or no question.
Okay, and that's okay. Sometimes when we have these community conversations, we're going to have discourse, disagreement.
I know, but he said it. He said it. I'm giving him opportunity to clarify on the camera.
And can we do that when we complete this panel?
On the mic, I want him to clarify on the camera, on the mic.
There's a difference between somebody seeking asylum and being an immigrant. Somebody seeking asylum is somebody who is looking for a refuge.
Okay.
And an immigrant is somebody who's looking for another job.
Let's go ahead and move on. Wow. Kathy, if you could please come up. And I know that conversations are difficult and we want to remain respectful of everybody's time, and I know that we want answers. So please, I encourage you to stay afterward and continue that conversation if that's a possibility. Kathy? Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we're going to do thank yous to the panels, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to, good evening, I know it's late. I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. But let's start with our moderator, Maggie. Thank you
And
very
Tyrone,
much.
who had to leave, you did a great job.
Thank you to Tyrone, even though he had to leave. We just want to openly thank them. But thank you to our panelists. I'm the president of our I.C.E. Randolph organization, and I know it's late, and some of the people have left already. But before we do this, I wanted to make sure we gave our panelists a thank you. I really appreciate you being here, and if we call you again, I hope you're there for us another time. We will have to have a follow-up. Thank you. So I'd like to give each one of our panelists a thank you, a small token of appreciation.
And while she's doing that, I'd like to acknowledge Urban Core Collective. I know Becca was here with her baby and her family, but she had to go, I believe. But we're thankful for their partnership. I see Lorena back there. Hi, Lorena. And Bynum & Bynum LLC, RJ's Printing, Wealthy Theatre, of course. We ran over a little bit. We also had cultural cuisine from El Granjero Mexican Grill, Lai Thai Kitchen, Pupuseria El Salvador, and Southern Smoke. I hope everybody enjoyed the meals as well. I hope I didn't forget anybody other than the brilliance here on this panel. Another round of applause for our panelists and everything they contributed tonight.
Thank you so much. There is some food left, so as you're leaving, you're welcome to take a plate home for lunch tomorrow or for late dinner tonight.
Yeah.
Please do. I don't want to take all that food home. Again, thank you very, very much. We have the T-shirts that we've given to you all. The sizes may not be correct. I didn't want to offend anybody, so I made them all small sizes. So please exchange the correct size once you go out there. We have them out there at the table. Those T-shirts are for our organization, and you're welcome to purchase them. Someone will be out there to sell them to you. Again, thank you very, very much for coming out tonight. We will have a follow-up part 2. I don't know if Maggie mentioned that, but we will be working on a part 2. So thank you
And
again
please
very
remember
much.
that the deadline to register to vote, if you can help somebody do so, is coming up October 9th.
We
So-
do have applications out there if anyone needs to
Yes.
register to vote. We also have live streamed this event on Facebook, and I don't know how to do that, so for those of you that, I'm probably the worst person on Facebook. But it is out there. Share it with your community, your contacts, because this information does need to get out in the community. As the one sister said, or asked the question, how do we reach out to others? We have put it out there to as many people as we could, but it would be helpful if you share it with your contacts as well. Again, thank you very, very much.
And one more thing, we did invite the Department of Homeland Security, ICE, but we did not hear back from them. So I wanted to acknowledge and thank our panelists who did respond to their participation tonight. I'd like the panelists to take a quick picture at the backdrop, please, before you go. And thank you, audience. You've been gracious with your time and your and sharing your thinking tonight. Very, very thankful. Thank you so much.
Please get some food to take home.